Sounds great. So welcome everyone. My name is Valeria and we are now live. So this is not a recorded presentation. I am a data scientist at Monzo Bank and I work specifically with credit models. I joined there in March and before that I was at Lloyds Banking Group. So what we're going to be talking today is about bias, discrimination and fairness in classification models. The goal of this presentation is for you to be able to first understand where bias comes from. So we're going to be looking at different examples. And secondly, is to be able to understand what metrics are out there in order to be able to learn how you can identify bias in a new or existing model. If you have any questions as we move forward, please let me know on the chat. What we're going to be covering today, as mentioned earlier, is where bias comes from and the sources of discrimination. I'm going to provide a quick example how a classification model works in case you don't work directly with models. Then we're going to start looking into different mathematical definitions of fairness. They're very easy to understand. And then we're going to go more through a practical example and follow up with some conclusions. So the practical example is not from Monzo. It's something I started actually at university and a specific case study I looked into. I've been going through this type of work starting at university when I was working on a specific project and I was able to continue at Lloyds Banking Group, and I'm also getting involved with Monzo as well on this area. So first, where does discrimination come from? These are just a few examples of where discrimination comes from, but most importantly, I really think it's heavily captured by our bias data. So usually the way that it works is that you get a sample data set, and we need to remember that this is a reflection of what somebody decided to describe of how the world works. So we get a sample, but this is created by a human that might define what we are considering to be the reality. And as you might remember, this of course has a lot of missing information, in particular on a specific group of people. So we're going to be covering some of these parts with some examples. For instance, bias target. Let's talk about the Amazon case, where they were actually trying to create an algorithm that would potentially select CVs to interview and hire engineers. What happened in this case is that the algorithm wasn't ever selecting women. And the reason being on one side is that it had a very biased target. First of all, how do we even define what a good engineer is? And how do we even understand what a good CV is to be a good engineer? What was happening was that historically, it was possibly using historically a lot of CVs that were heavily male, and it was using a lot of male attributes and language. And therefore, like the whole data set, it could not really learn from many women. And possibly the women were quite unique in the way that we could not really generalize and select women in the future. So this is a good example of having a biased target and also low representation of women in this group. Then we have many other aspects, and this is one that is really sensitive and is the likelihood of reoffense. So there's a company called Compass that develops algorithm to decide how likely you are to reoffense, and then judges use this information to decide whether you get a parole or whether you can, a lot of times where you go back to jail or not, or aspects around specific crimes. What happened here is that we had a lot of points where discrimination could take part and that this company did not take into account. First, again, bias target. How do we even understand whether you were, we already know that certain communities are jailed way more often and end up reoffending more often. So it is not a fair assumption that they will all end up in the same situation in the same way. Then we have historical discrimination. We know that specific group of people, such as the Black community or Latino in the US, they end up being chased by the police more often. So we know they're going to end up in a population that looks as more likely to reoffend by default. We also have reinforcement bias, which is very similar. We know that that police will always target specific groups more often. So that ends up having a population that is more likely to reoffend because they're targeted more often. And finally, representation, which I wanted to look that into here, for instance. When we looked at, and this is something I wanted to mention about how certain people end up reoffending more often, but if we also look at the data, if you look at the risk scores of the Black defendants and the white defendants, you will notice that it's quite flat for the Black community, but then for whites, we have in the sample many more who are on a score of 1. So what the model is going to pick up is that if you're white, and the model can pick up through proxies, it's possibly going to more likely to assign you as a low risk offender. Now, if we go back to this, something that is important to remember is that when the algorithm learned from this very biased data set, it ended up having a lot of discriminatory outcomes as well. And the way that ProPublica, an organization that looks into these details, was to analyze how many times were we making mistakes when you were targeted as a high risk of reoffense, but you were actually not. And also how often were you assigned a very low score, but in reality, you were very likely to reoffense. And what we can see is that the African-American group, they will always end up having the kind of score that is the bad one. And this is like you were very low likely to reoffend, but actually you got high risk. And it was the opposite for the white population, where they were normally more likely to mark as low risk of reoffense when they were actually high. So there was unfairness in the kind of errors that we're getting that was different. And another part around representation is that there were very few women in the whole sample. So when the people from ProPublica were looking at the results, they actually noticed that females, they seem more likely also to reoffend, and they had normally a higher score, even though they shouldn't. And this is because there was not proper data and proper representation in the sample. Finally, another very important part, which is also very relevant when we talk about credit models, is missing and wrong data. For instance, in the US, 30% of low-income consumers are actually credit invisible. 50% of them, they are unscorable. So we have a huge problem of if we actually create an automated solution, we're going to be discriminating many people because we don't have the right solution. So automation is not always the only way of going ahead. And just to provide a counter example, I've talked to some people in South Africa, for instance, that they know there are a lot of people who are unscorable. So what they actually do is that they go to the communities, they collect even pieces of paper where they annotate so many kind of credits that they do within their communities, but they're just written in paper. So there are a lot of different ways that we can actually innovate without necessarily going on full mode automation. Now, just a classification example so that we can understand how to analyze the metrics around fairness. First of all let's assume we are creating a model purely based on income. And we have some people who have repaid in the past and some people who have defaulted in the past. The idea in a classification model is that you want to find a nice threshold that will let you to distinguish people who you should give a loan in the future or decline. So here we're converting income basically into a probability of how risky you are to pay, so on how likely you are to pay back your loan or not. And we're going to say that if we set the threshold there, everyone who's below the threshold, we're going to deny loans. And everyone who is above the threshold, we actually grant them a loan because we believe that these are the people that are more likely to repay back. We call a true positive whenever we are above the threshold, and we're classifying this person as somebody who will repay in the future. And when we look at the actual values, we know, yeah, this person actually paid back. So we're happy with this. And we call a false positive when we're classifying somebody as repaying, but reality is that they've defaulted in the past, so we should have not given them a loan. Defining now fairness. So how do we actually define it? Actually, how does it work at the moment? This is how it works now for most models that are launched in the world. It is fairness through an awareness. We basically just close our eyes, we'll build a model, and that's it. So we don't really look into what the consequences could be. It's very hard to monitor and so on. So that's how most models work at the moment. What could actually go wrong? So let's say we're trying to build an algorithm that will decide who we should hire as a CEO. And we have data on age, income, education, number of sales. What might happen is that we end up with somebody like this who has loads of sales, a degree in engineering, and graduated from Oxford in reality. So the actor from Mr. Bean actually, he matches those attributes. What is happening is that in this kind of model, it would only look into what happened in the past. So if you want to change the future, then there's no way this can actually happen because the past has not seen many representations of women. So the model will be able to pick up male attributes in this case and just reflect whatever it saw in the past. And the way that we actually want to live in the future, so we want to change the status quo. And algorithms are not good at that because they only reflect what is so in the past. Now, fairness through demographic parity. So what is this? This is a metric that is used a lot. What it actually says is that we're going to provide the reward at equal rates. If you think about the loans, it would be like saying, we're going to make sure that group A, let's say female, and group B, let's say male, they both get the same proportion of loans. So if you look a bit more in terms of metrics, that is like saying, give me everyone who we are going to be providing the loan. These are, let's say, these 4 here because they're above the threshold cut. And let's divide it by everyone. In that way, we get demographic, in that way, we know the proportion of people we're providing the loan. And that is 50%. And in an ideal world for demographic parity, both groups should have the same. So that is everyone who's classified as paid divided by classified by everyone. If you ever use confusion metrics, that is like saying, give me everyone who's positive divided by all, and you have all the values there. And that's a way to analyze whether the positive rate is exactly the same between both groups. A good example of so demographic parity is not always perfect, but let's view an example that I believe it's actually really good for. So the University of Oxford provided, they're trying to increase the group of people they accept that come from more disadvantaged backgrounds. So they're not aiming necessarily at this point to have equal demographic parity, but at least to be able to close the gap. And I think in this case, it's important because they are trying to change the state of our current world. So they know there's some people that are unprivileged and they haven't had the same opportunities as others to make it to the same level. And there might be a difference in A levels or scores, and they're fine with it because they actually what they're planning to do is to provide an extra year of education or additional support so that they make it to the same level. And this is important because if you don't do anything about it, what might happen is that it just creates reinforcement bias that specific group of people will never be at the same level. So that's what I think demographic parity in this case is a good example because it wants to change the way the world works at the moment, and it also has proper, some very good methods in order to make sure that we mitigate any potential bias that can go afterwards. So let me give you now another example. So we're now going to be hiring a dancing crew. And we have a group of singers, dancers, and actors. And my personal belief is that actors are going to do a really bad job at dancing because they're normally not used to it. So I'm very biased on that end. What might happen is something like this, where we see the singers and the dancers dancing really well because they're used to it. And then I see an example like that where, yeah, he doesn't do a great job. So I'm reinforcing my own bias. What I forgot to mention in this case is that the number of actors was really small. So the probability that somebody like him will end up in this case is actually very high. And yeah, that can create reinforcement bias, which is what we're trying to avoid. So what could we do? Some academics have proposed equal opportunity as a different metric. What this case does, so in the one before we're saying everyone should get the reward at equal rates. But here we're saying everyone should get the reward, but only if they qualify for it. In mathematical terms, what this looks like is give me everyone who should really get the reward, so let's say these two, and divided by all the people that should have gotten it. So these are these 4, or here 1 divided by 2. In that way, we're getting equal opportunity. And that is saying like, give me everyone who we classify as repaid and actually repaid, divided by everyone who repaid. What this is doing is looking at everyone who should get a reward and making sure that only those who qualify for it actually get it. And in terms of classification, in confusion matrix terms, it is like saying, let's make sure that both groups have the same true positive rate. Now, this is what, I mean, some people say this is like fair dancing, but only if you can dance. However, what could go wrong with it? So this is where it really could go wrong. If we look at group A, let's say this is a majority of people, we see here that 75% have the same true positive rate. That is like saying out of all the people who should have been part of the dancing group, we classify properly 75%. However, what it might happen is that we get the same result on group B, but we get a lot of these people here who are people like him who cannot really dance very well. So this is another case where it might just continue reinforcing my own bias of saying like, yeah, actors cannot really dance. So that leads me to when do we actually use equal opportunity as a metric? And I think fraud detection is actually a good example where let's assume, so we have 2 types of errors. The first one is when fraud takes place, but we actually, and we're unable to detect it. So equal opportunity will make sure that we detect fraud equally well for everyone. However, because equal opportunity it wouldn't look at the people that they mentioned that it was fraud when it actually wasn't. And we're sort of okay with that because what it might happen is that you're going to get a call from the bank saying, I think we've detected fraud, and you're going to say, no, it was actually me. So that's not too bad of an error. So I believe equal opportunity could be a good example for fraud detection. It has a very strong emphasis on the positive outcome. In this case, it would be, this is fraud. And the false positive, which is like when they give you a call and they ask you, is this fraud? And you respond no. It's not very costly for the user nor for the company. And also another part that I want to mention, the target variable is not subjective. So you properly know when this is fraud or not when you're training your model, which is very different than when you're hiring somebody. I mean, who does define what a good engineer actually is, which is very subjective. Now, fairness through equalized odds. This is another metric, and it's actually one that I think it's really important when you're working with very sensitive information and also when the target variable is very clear. What this actually tells you, so remember, we've looked at positive rate, true positive rate. The only difference between equalized odds and the previous metric I mentioned before is that we're introducing a new rule. So equalized odds also looks into making sure that everyone who gets the loan should get, across everyone who should have gotten the loan, which ones they got the loan. So that's a true positive rate, but also into the errors on the other side, on the negatives. And with that, on that, what I mean is that out of all the people who should have not gotten the loan, which of them did we actually give it to? So that would be our false positive rate. If we look at this part, we have 4 people here that they defaulted in the past, and only 1 that we actually would have provided a loan because the model says so. So the false positive rate in this case is 25%. And in this case, it's exactly the same because we have 4 and 1 here. So equalized odds basically tells you that from all the people who should have gotten the loan, we're providing the exact right ones. But also when we make mistakes on people who should have not given the loan, then this is the same kind of error. So in confusion matrix terms, this is like saying we must ensure that a true positive rate or false positive rate is as close as possible between groups. Or this is also like in more language terms, it's like saying, in human terms, it's saying predicting equally well those who will repay and making equal rate of mistakes across those who default. So when do we actually use equalized odds? I think credit models is a really good example, in particular when you look about loans or overdrafts. And the reason being is that we care about making sure that we predict those who will repay back, because otherwise we go out of business. But also when we look at people who, at the people who should have not gotten the loan, of course it affects the bank, but it can also affect badly the credit score of people. So we want to make sure we land in a very responsible way, not just for the bank itself or for the lender, but also for the actual customer. Because if it's not responsible to lend to that person, we shouldn't do it in order to avoid damaging the score. So yeah, this is a good example. And also the target variable is very objective. So we know from the past whether the person paid back or not. And let me quickly show you an external case study that I worked with at a university. This is from a public data set. It is not Monzo data. So this is from a peer-to-peer lending platform. And what I did basically was to look, just created like a random a classification model. I wanted to look at how well does it work on a young population and an older population. And what I could see is what we normally look at the ROC curve in models. So, and this is what we've been talking about before, true positive rate and false positive rate. And at this stage, what you need to know is that the more area it covers, the better the model. And we can see that depending on where we set a threshold, the model might work slightly better from one group than the other. Nevertheless, in the case I looked at, the area under the curve, which is a metric to show like the higher the better. In an ideal world, it should be the same between the two groups. And I noticed that it was a very, very small difference. So something like between 77 and 76. So I wouldn't be able to say we see a definite discrimination here. Then I looked at what happens if I decide to ensure the specific fairness metrics that I was discussing about. And what we can see that is usually very similar, apart from equalized odds, which is the most, so what we're looking at here is the true positive rate and the false positive rate. And the yellow line is how much revenue we would get. And I did this very easily, how much profit. And I just counted basically, basically every true positive rate counted as 1 point, and every false positive, it would subtract 2. And what we could see is that the potential profit in this case would have dropped a lot if we would have ensured equalized odds. So we need to keep that in mind. Another thing is that I was making sure that there was nearly no gap. If I would have relaxed it a bit more, of course, the profit would have been slightly different and possibly higher. But it's something that we also need to keep in the back of our heads. Finally, some conclusions. So I hope you learn and find interest in the way so you can actually measure fairness. It's very widespread in academia, and it needs to start coming also into the field of data science. And something I wanted to leave you with as key takeaways is that I don't think we can make a model unfair. So models learn from data, and if your data is wrong, your model will also have wrong output. So one way of trying to solve this is by looking, do we have the right data, and is it good enough across all people? Then we cannot always measure how unfair a model is. One of the examples would be with hiring. It's so subjective that I don't think it's appropriate for algorithms to decide whether you have the right words on your CV or not. But we can analyze always like points of bias in models whenever we're trying to sort of structure something. And another part is super important, that this group needs to be very diverse. Otherwise, we might miss a lot of points where bias and discrimination can come that we are unaware of. And finally, we cannot always assess an unfair model if we don't collect protected classes information. So if you don't have data on gender, age, and this kind of sensitive information, there's no way for you to assess it. I'm not saying that you should use those variables as your predictors. It is just as a matter of like, once you've built a model, or once you're looking at your data, how does it look when you actually separate it by the different protected classes? With that in mind, that's all on my side. So if you have any questions, please let me know. Oh, sorry, I just noticed this other one. There you go, this other chat. Perfect. So I think there are no more questions, so we might be able to end soon. Okay, so I see a few ones. Perfect. So how do you think different industries are tackling bias compared to finance? There's not proper, I think finance looks a bit more on it, especially, I mean, when we talk about credit models, the way that it basically goes ahead is by making things more explainable, which is very important because of the sensitivity of the outcome. And other industries that are not so regulated, I think they're not even looking at it, honestly. It takes a lot of work and a lot of discussion, so that's one of the issues. Then let me look at it one. What are most excited to be working on in 2021? I think from a bias perspective, it's gonna be really hard, but at the same time very interesting to understand how COVID impacts results and how we actually model to identify what might be happening in different subgroups, and at the same time that we're responsible about how we handle this information. So there's now a question about cutoffs. So if you make an adjustment for the 40-year cutoff, how would you impact it? I think if I'm understanding your question correctly, the way that some people, so when you use the external tools that exist to understand bias, it's usually binary, so you can only have two. And the way that some people do it is that they select one group, let's say from the age of 20 to 30 and 30 plus, and they repeat the process several times. And if I have not answered this, please just reach on me on LinkedIn and I'm happy to answer via text.